Welcome to Top 10 Secret, where the shadows whisper and the unseen horrors of the world come alive. Tonight, we uncover the unspeakable truths that lurk just beyond the veil of your nightmares. Brace yourself. What you learn here will haunt you forever. Story 1. The Haunting of Silverwood Cemetery. Silverwood Cemetery was infamous in the small town of Hollow Creek, Massachusetts. Shrouded in layers of dense fog and surrounded by a forest of dead, gnarled trees, the cemetery had a reputation that sent shivers down the spine of even the bravest souls. Locals spoke of strange disappearances, unexplainable noises, and figures that moved in the shadows. Some called it cursed, others called it evil. The stories intrigued four adventurous friends: Ethan, Claire, Rachel, and Josh. They were all in their early 20s, the kind of age when danger feels like a distant concept and fear is just an adrenaline rush. On Halloween night, they made a pact. They would explore Silverwood Cemetery and prove to themselves that the legends were nothing more than superstitions. The night was bone-chillingly cold, the air heavy with the scent of decaying leaves. Armed with flashlights, snacks, and an old map of the cemetery Ethan had found online, the group entered the iron gates of Silverwood. The gates groaned as if protesting their intrusion. "This place is way creepier than I expected," Rachel whispered, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Come on, it's just an old graveyard," Ethan said, though his voice betrayed a hint of unease. The first few rows of gravestones were unremarkable. Weathered names, faded dates, and cryptic epitaphs. But as they ventured deeper, the atmosphere grew heavier, as though the air itself was thicker. Claire stopped abruptly. "Did you guys feel that?" "Feel what?" Josh asked. "A temperature drop. It's freezing all of a sudden," Claire said, rubbing her arms. Rachel nodded. "She's right. It's like we just walked into a freezer." Ethan shined his flashlight ahead. "Let's keep going. Maybe we'll find something interesting." As they moved deeper into the cemetery, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the sound of crunching leaves underfoot. But soon, they grew louder. "Did you hear that?" Rachel asked, spinning around. "Hear what?" Ethan replied, his voice tense. "Someone's whispering," Rachel insisted. Josh scoffed. "It's probably the wind." But as they stood still, the whispers became unmistakable. Multiple voices speaking in a language none of them recognized. The sound seemed to come from all directions, encircling them. "Okay, that's not the wind," Claire said, her voice trembling. "Let's just keep moving," Ethan said, his bravado slipping. The group pressed on, their flashlights darting around nervously. The gravestones became more elaborate, adorned with strange carvings that looked like ancient symbols. Suddenly, Rachel gasped and pointed. "Over there!" In the distance, a figure stood motionless among the graves. It was tall and cloaked in black, its face obscured by the shadows. "Who's there?" Ethan called out, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move. "Maybe it's just a statue," Josh suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Statues don't just appear out of nowhere," Claire said, backing away. Without warning, the figure turned and glided behind a cluster of headstones, disappearing into the darkness. "We need to leave. Now," Rachel said, her voice shaking. But when they turned around, the path they had taken was gone. The rows of gravestones had rearranged themselves, forming a labyrinth. This isn't possible," Ethan stammered. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though the unseen voices were arguing amongst themselves. The temperature plummeted further, and an overwhelming sense of dread settled over the group. Suddenly, Claire screamed. She clutched her arm, where a hand-shaped bruise was forming as if someone or something had grabbed her. "Who did that?" she cried, tears streaming down her face. "No one touched you," Josh yelled, his flashlight flickering wildly. Ethan grabbed Claire's arm. "We have to stick together. "Don't panic." But panic was already taking hold. As they stumbled through the twisting paths, the shadows began to move. What were once still outlines cast by gravestones now writhed and stretched, reaching toward them like living creatures. Rachel tripped and fell, screaming as something unseen dragged her by her ankles. The others grabbed her arms, pulling her back with all their strength. But whatever was pulling her was stronger. "Don't let go!" Rachel screamed, her voice raw with terror. With a final yank, the group managed to free her, but her legs were covered in deep scratches, oozing blood. "We're not going to make it out of here," Rachel sobbed. "Don't say that," Ethan snapped. The group stumbled into a clearing dominated by a massive mausoleum. Its doors were ajar, revealing a staircase leading down into darkness. "We can hide in there," Josh suggested. "Are you insane? That's a trap," Claire shouted. Before they could decide, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The gravestones around them cracked open, and skeletal hands emerged, clawing at the earth. "Run!" Ethan screamed. They had no choice but to descend into the mausoleum. The stairs seemed endless, spiraling down into a cold, damp chamber. The chamber was lit by a faint, unnatural glow. In the center stood an ancient altar, surrounded by more of the strange symbols they had seen earlier. "This is wrong. We shouldn't be here," Claire whispered. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the chamber. The shadows on the walls coalesced into a single form, a towering figure with hollow eyes that burned like fire. "You trespass on sacred ground," it intoned, its voice resonating through their bones. "We're sorry, we didn't mean to," Ethan pleaded. "Your apologies are meaningless. The dead demand payment." One by one, the figure turned its gaze to them. Josh was the first to fall, his body crumpling to the ground as though drained of life. Rachel followed, her screams echoing in the chamber. Ethan and Claire tried to run, but the shadows closed in, enveloping them in darkness. Days later, search parties found no trace of the group, except for their flashlights scattered near the entrance of Silverwood Cemetery. Locals added their names to the long list of those who had vanished in the cursed graveyard. The whispers continued, louder than ever, as if the cemetery was hungry for more. To this day, no one dares to enter Silverwood Cemetery at night. And those who pass by swear they can hear voices calling from within, begging for help, or luring the next victim. Story 2. The House of Swallows. It is said that in a desolate village, deep within the dense forest of a remote mountainous region, there lies an abandoned house. People call it the House of Swallows, because flocks of ominous swallows are always seen perched on its roof. The terrifying story of the house has become a haunting legend passed down through generations. Long ago, the house belonged to the Morin family, a powerful yet secretive lineage. The family was declared cursed after a tragic incident. During a lavish party one evening, the family's only daughter mysteriously disappeared. Guests claimed they saw her being dragged into the forest by a strange creature cloaked in a long black robe. From that night on, the Morin family fell into ruin. The father went mad, cursing the world for the misfortune that had befallen his family. Eventually, he took his own life in the house. The terrified servants fled, leaving the house to decay and become a haunted relic. A group of young friends decided to test their courage by spending a night in the House of Swallows. They were 4 in total: Mark, Alice, John, and Lisa. Mark, the leader, was always seeking new, daring experiences, while Alice and Lisa, though timid, didn't want to appear cowardly. John, the most practical of the group, only joined to ensure no one got hurt. As dusk fell, the group stepped into the house. It was cold and damp, with moldy floors, cracked walls, and shattered windows. The eerie flutter of swallows echoed from the corners, and the flock on the roof seemed to glare at them with menacing eyes. While exploring the ground floor, they discovered an old journal, weathered by time but still legible. The journal belonged to the house's former owner, who wrote of terrifying nights following his daughter's disappearance. He described hearing eerie laughter in the dark, creaking noises from the attic, and cold apparitions of his lost daughter, her face twisted into an unrecognizable horror. Something had been reawakened in the house. Quietly, Mark felt as if the house was coming alive, demanding something from the group. As they were engrossed in the journal, a loud thud came from the attic above. Lisa screamed and clung to John, while Mark tried to reassure everyone that it was just the wind or an animal. But the noises grew louder, as if something heavy was being dragged across the rotting wooden floor. "We need to check it out," Mark said, trying to stay calm. John shook his head in protest, but curiosity overpowered fear. Mark grabbed a flashlight and led the way up the creaky stairs to the attic. When the attic door creaked open, a wave of icy air swept down, carrying a foul, rotten stench. The weak beam of the flashlight revealed horrifying sights: torn family portraits, broken chairs, and in the center of the room, a large box sealed with rusted wires. "What's inside?" Alice whispered shakily, her voice barely audible. Mark approached, his hands trembling as he pried open the box. As the lid creaked open, a blood-curdling scream echoed from within. The box was empty, yet the sound lingered, sending chills down their spines. From the shadows of the attic, a faint figure emerged. It was a girl, but her face was grotesquely distorted, no longer human. Her hollow eyes glowed with a crimson light, and her mouth stretched into an unnaturally wide grin. "You've come here," she whispered, her voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. "You will not leave without paying the price." Lisa screamed and tried to run, but the attic door slammed shut, trapping them inside. Alice collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, while Mark and John frantically tried to force the door open. But their efforts were futile. The girl began to move closer, her steps slow and deliberate, each one more terrifying than the last. "You have awakened me," she hissed, her voice distorting into something inhuman. "I am the curse of this house, and you will become the new souls to sustain it." In a moment of desperation, Mark threw the flashlight at her. The light flared briefly, and the girl vanished. But almost immediately, maniacal laughter echoed from every corner of the room. The group was surrounded by ghostly figures, their glowing red eyes piercing the darkness. Lisa let out one final scream before being dragged into the shadows. John and Alice tried to escape, but it felt as if the house itself was alive, its walls closing in, wooden beams falling to block their path. Mark was the last one standing. He stood in the center of the room, looking around in despair. "We didn't mean to disturb you," he shouted. "Please, let us go." But all he received was a chilling laugh. Darkness enveloped Mark, and he felt cold, lifeless hands dragging him into the void. The next morning, villagers found the house eerily silent. There was no sign of the young friends, only the flock of swallows perched on the roof, glaring down with mocking eyes. The legend of the House of Swallows lives on, and no one dares to step inside. They know that once you enter, you will never come out. Story 3. The Crying Room. It was an old urban legend, passed around among college students and late-night storytellers. Everyone knew someone who had heard the cries, but never anyone who had dared to investigate. They called it the Crying Room, a small, dilapidated apartment at the edge of campus that had been abandoned for years. Rumors swirled about what had happened there, but the most common story was that a girl had lived there alone and vanished one night after weeks of her neighbors reporting eerie, muffled sobbing from her unit. The sound stopped when she disappeared. That's where it should have ended. But then, the sobbing started again, even though the apartment was empty. Jake, a sophomore with a reputation for being a thrill-seeker, decided he was going to spend the night in the crying room. His friends, Emily, Mark, and Sarah, reluctantly agreed to join him. though none of them felt as brave as they pretended to be. They armed themselves with flashlights, a camera, and enough snacks to make it through the night. They figured it would be nothing more than a good scare, something to laugh about later. The building was as foreboding as they had imagined. Its windows were boarded up, the walls streaked with graffiti and grime. The air smelled damp and metallic, and the faint sound of creaking wood echoed as they pushed open the warped door. "This is it," Jake said, his voice barely steady. "Room 306, the crying room." The door was already ajar. Inside, the apartment was surprisingly bare. The walls were cracked, the floorboards warped, and the faint smell of mildew permeated the air. But there was something else. An oppressive, unexplainable weight that made the air feel heavier. It was as if the room was holding its breath. At first, nothing happened. They played cards, told jokes, and tried to keep the atmosphere light. Emily set up the camera on a tripod, pointing it toward the door to capture anything unusual. But as the hours dragged on, their laughter faded and the tension grew. The silence of the room seemed to press against their eardrums. Around midnight, it started. A faint sound, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. But it wasn't. It was rhythmic, deliberate. It was crying. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, clutching Mark's arm. The group fell silent, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, echoing through the apartment. It wasn't just sobbing. It was gut-wrenching, filled with despair. It sounded close. "It's probably just someone messing with us," Jake said, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. He stood and shone his flashlight around the room. Nothing. "What if it's not?" Emily muttered, her eyes darting nervously to the camera. She checked the footage but saw nothing unusual. Still, the crying continued, unrelenting and suffocating. By 2 a.m., the atmosphere had shifted. The room felt colder, and the crying, though still disembodied, seemed to move, circling them. Emily swore she saw a shadow dart across the wall, but when Jake turned his flashlight, there was nothing there. "We should leave," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "This isn't funny anymore." "We said we'd stay the night," Jake replied, though even he sounded unsure. "It's just a prank. Someone's trying to scare us." But deep down, they all knew it wasn't a prank. There was no one else in the building. Mark suggested they all sit together in the center of the room, backs to one another, so they could see every angle. They huddled close, flashlights in hand, scanning the room for any sign of movement. The crying grew louder, almost deafening, and then it stopped. The silence was worse. It was Emily who saw it first. A figure standing in the far corner of the room. It was barely visible, shrouded in shadow, but its presence was undeniable. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing. The others turned, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, hunched, as if watching them. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move, slowly, deliberately, toward them. Sarah screamed, and the group scrambled to their feet. Mark swung his flashlight wildly, but the figure disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. The crying resumed, louder than ever, echoing all around them. "We need to go," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. She bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard they pulled or pushed, it remained firmly shut. "What's happening?" Mark yelled, panic overtaking him. The room seemed to close in on them, the walls bending and warping as the crying turned into laughter, low, guttural, and inhuman. Emily checked the camera, desperate to find some explanation, but what she saw made her blood run cold. The screen showed not 4 people, but 5. A 5th figure stood among them, its face obscured, but its hand rested lightly on Jake's shoulder. "Jake," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't move." "Why?" he asked. But before she could answer, he screamed and fell to the ground, clutching his chest. The figure was gone, but Jake's skin was ice cold, his eyes wide with terror. The room descended into chaos. The shadows moved on their own, the crying morphing into screams. Emily's flashlight flickered and died, leaving them in near total darkness. She felt something brush against her arm, cold, clammy, and unmistakably real. "We're not alone," she gasped, her voice breaking. By dawn, only Emily emerged from the apartment. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes hollow. When the police arrived, they found no trace of the others. The room was empty, save for the camera, which had recorded everything. The footage showed the group huddled together, the shadows closing in. One by one, they vanished, their screams swallowed by the oppressive silence. The last frame was of Emily, staring directly into the camera, her lips moving as if to say something. But no sound came through. To this day, no one knows what happened in the crying room. The apartment remains abandoned, the sobbing heard only by those foolish enough to get too close. And Emily? She never spoke of that night again. But sometimes, late at night, her neighbors hear faint crying coming from her apartment. Story 4. The Midnight Bus. In a sprawling metropolis that never seemed to sleep, legends whispered about a bus route that only appeared after midnight. Known as Route 375, the vehicle was said to have no set destination, and anyone who boarded it was never seen again. It was a cold, foggy night when Daniel, an exhausted office worker, found himself stranded at a deserted bus stop. His phone was dead, the streets were empty, and the only sound was the distant hum of the city. As he contemplated walking home, the air grew still, and a faint rumble approached from the darkness. Emerging from the fog was a rickety old bus, its headlights barely piercing the gloom. The number 375 flickered faintly on its display. Daniel hesitated but eventually climbed aboard. The interior was dimly lit, with cracked seats and an air of disuse. The driver, a gaunt man with sunken eyes, didn't say a word. Daniel glanced around. Apart from the driver, there was only one other passenger, an old man sitting in the farthest corner, his face obscured by shadows. The bus jerked forward, lurching into motion. Daniel settled into a seat near the middle, trying to shake off an inexplicable sense of dread. The vehicle moved through streets he didn't recognize, the familiar cityscape giving way to dark, narrow alleys lined with skeletal trees. The fog outside thickened, swallowing the world beyond the windows. As the bus rumbled on, the air inside grew colder. Daniel shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. He tried to distract himself by scrolling through his dead phone, but the device refused to turn on. Then came the sound. Soft at first, like a distant whisper, but growing louder. It was crying, a low, mournful wail that seemed to echo through the bus. Daniel looked back at the old man, who remained motionless, staring out the window. "Do you hear that?" Daniel asked, his voice shaking. The old man turned slightly, his hollow eyes meeting Daniel's. "Get off at the next stop," the old man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you value your life." Daniel's stomach churned. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. But the old man turned back to the window, saying nothing more. The crying grew louder, filling the space with an oppressive weight. It wasn't just crying. It was despair given form, a sound that clawed at Daniel's sanity. The bus slowed to a halt in the middle of nowhere. There were no streetlights, no buildings, just an endless expanse of fog. The doors hissed open, and the old man stood. Without a word, he shuffled off the bus, disappearing into the mist. Daniel wanted to follow but hesitated. The driver turned his head slightly, revealing pale, sunken features. "Staying?" he asked, his voice rasping like dry leaves. Swallowing hard, Daniel nodded. The doors closed, and the bus lurched forward once more. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Daniel glanced around, his unease mounting. The windows now showed not streets, but endless rows of withered trees, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The lights inside the bus flickered, casting long, shifting shadows. Then he saw them. Figures, barely discernible in the fog outside, keeping pace with the bus. They moved unnaturally, their limbs jerking as if manipulated by unseen strings. Daniel's breath quickened. He banged on the window, but the figures didn't react. "Stop the bus!" he shouted, but the driver ignored him. The figures outside began to multiply, their twisted forms pressing closer to the vehicle. And then, without warning, one of them appeared inside the bus. It was a woman, or what had once been a woman. Her face was pale and bloated, her eyes black voids that seemed to absorb the dim light. She opened her mouth, emitting a guttural wail that echoed through the bus. Daniel scrambled backward, tripping over a seat as more figures materialized around him. Daniel's heart pounded as the bus filled with the grotesque entities. They surrounded him, their hollow eyes staring, their twisted mouths forming silent screams. He stumbled toward the driver, desperate for help. "Please, let me off," he begged. But the driver's face was no longer human. His skin had turned a sickly gray, his eyes glowing faintly as he grinned, revealing jagged teeth. "You should have gotten off," the driver said, his voice distorted. "Now, you're part of the route." The bus shuddered violently, the walls warping and closing in. Daniel screamed as the figures lunged at him, their cold, clammy hands dragging him into the darkness. The bus was found abandoned on the outskirts of the city, its interior charred and empty. There was no sign of Daniel or the driver. Witnesses claimed to see a faint light flickering in the fog that night, accompanied by the sound of distant crying. Route 375 remains a mystery, its legend growing with each retelling. Some say the bus still appears, offering rides to those foolish enough to board. But all agree on one thing. Once you step onto the midnight bus, you're never seen again. Story 5. The Clown in the Corner. It started like any other night. Rachel, a 17-year-old high school senior, took a babysitting job for a wealthy family in an upscale neighborhood. The Callahans were kind enough, with 2 young kids, Tommy and Grace, who were already asleep when Rachel arrived. The parents had plans for a late-night dinner and assured Rachel that she would have an easy evening. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to call," Mrs. Callahan said before leaving. Rachel smiled and waved them off, already thinking about the snacks in her backpack and the movie she planned to watch after checking on the kids. The house was massive, with rooms that seemed to stretch endlessly and walls adorned with expensive artwork. Rachel had babysat for the Callahans before, but something about the house felt different that night. The air was colder, and the silence seemed heavier. She brushed it off as her imagination and settled on the couch in the living room, scrolling through her phone. That's when she noticed it. In the corner of the room stood a clown statue. It was life-sized, dressed in a garish, old-fashioned costume, complete with oversized shoes and a ruffled collar. Its painted face wore a permanent smile, but the eyes, black, empty pits, seemed to follow her as she moved. Rachel shivered. She didn't remember seeing it there before. Trying to ignore the unsettling figure, she turned on the TV and focused on her movie. But every few minutes, her eyes would drift back to the statue. The room felt colder now, and she swore she could hear faint whispers, though she chalked it up to the wind outside. Halfway through the movie, Rachel's unease grew unbearable. She grabbed her phone and called Mrs. Callahan. "Hey, Mrs. Callahan," Rachel began, her voice shaky. "This might sound silly, but do you have a clown statue in your living room? It's kind of freaking me out. Can I cover it with a blanket or something?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. longer than Rachel expected. Then Mrs. Callahan's voice returned, strained and urgent. "We don't have a clown statue." Rachel froze, her heart pounding. She turned slowly toward the corner where the clown statue had been. But now the corner was empty. "Get the kids and get out of the house," Mrs. Callahan instructed, her voice trembling. "Call the police. We're on our way." Rachel didn't need to be told twice. She bolted upstairs to the kids' room. Tommy and Grace were sound asleep, oblivious to the terror unfolding downstairs. She shook them awake, whispering for them to stay quiet. As they made their way back down the stairs, Rachel heard faint footsteps behind her. She turned, her breath hitching, but the hallway was empty. She quickened her pace, practically dragging the kids toward the front door. Just as Rachel reached for the doorknob, a chilling laugh echoed through the house. It was low, guttural, and inhuman. The kids screamed, and Rachel yanked the door open, pulling them outside into the night. She didn't stop running until they were halfway down the driveway. The police arrived minutes later, followed closely by the Callahans. Officers searched the house but found no sign of anyone inside. The clown statue was gone. Rachel never babysat again. She struggled to sleep for weeks, haunted by nightmares of black, empty eyes and that terrible laugh. The Callahans moved out shortly after, unable to shake the lingering presence in their home. But the story doesn't end there. A year later, Rachel was working at a small coffee shop in a nearby town. One evening, as she was closing up, she glanced out the window and froze. Across the street, illuminated by a flickering streetlight, stood the clown. It wasn't a statue this time. It moved, its head tilting slowly as if acknowledging her. Rachel backed away from the window, her heart racing. When she looked again, the figure was gone. She locked up quickly and drove home, checking her rearview mirror every few seconds. That night, she barely slept, her mind replaying the encounter over and over. Weeks passed without incident, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She began noticing small things out of place in her apartment. A chair moved slightly, a door left ajar, a faint smell of grease paint in the air. One night, as she was lying in bed, Rachel awoke to a soft creaking sound. Her room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. She reached for her phone, but it wasn't on her nightstand where she had left it. As she turned to look for it, her eyes caught something in the corner of the room. The clown was there, standing perfectly still, its black eyes locked on hers. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then it smiled, wider than should have been possible, revealing rows of sharp yellow teeth. Rachel screamed, but the sound was cut off as the clown lunged at her, its cold, clammy hands wrapping around her throat. She fought desperately, but its grip was unrelenting. The last thing she saw was its twisted, grinning face. When Rachel's co-workers found her apartment the next morning, the door was locked, and everything appeared untouched. There was no sign of Rachel, except for a single red balloon tied to her bed frame. The police investigated but found no leads. Her disappearance was eventually ruled a missing persons case, though those who knew her whispered about the clown. To this day, there are reports of a clown statue appearing in homes and businesses across the area. It never stays in one place for long, but wherever it goes, people vanish. And those who see it never forget the way its black eyes seem to watch, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Story 6. The Man Who Watched. Every night, like clockwork, Claire saw him. The man stood across the street from her apartment, tall and unnervingly still. He always positioned himself directly under the flickering streetlight, his face obscured by shadows. But she could feel his gaze boring into her through her bedroom window. At first, she thought it was just her imagination. Perhaps he was a late-night smoker or someone waiting for a ride. But night after night, he was there. motionless, unblinking, and staring straight at her window. She tried to convince herself it was nothing. She closed the blinds, turned up her music, and even avoided looking out the window altogether. But the man's presence gnawed at her nerves. She could feel him watching, even when she couldn't see him. One evening, after 3 consecutive weeks of his silent vigil, Claire finally called the police. She felt foolish as she explained the situation over the phone. What could she say? A man was standing on a public street, doing nothing but staring. Still, the operator promised to send someone to check it out. When the officers arrived, Claire peeked out of her window. The streetlight was empty, the man gone. The officers found no one and reassured her it was likely a harmless loiterer. But as soon as their patrol car disappeared down the street, Claire's heart sank. The man was back, standing in the exact same spot as before. That night, Claire struggled to sleep. She left her bedside lamp on, its dim light casting long shadows across the room. Just as she was drifting off, a sound jolted her awake. It was faint, like the creak of a floorboard, but enough to set her nerves on edge. She held her breath, listening intently, but the apartment was silent. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself, "just the building settling." But the next morning, she found something that chilled her to the core. On her kitchen counter was a single blackened fingerprint, smudged against the pristine white surface. She lived alone. The next few nights, Claire couldn't bring herself to sleep. The man continued to stand under the streetlight, his silhouette unwavering. She kept every light in her apartment on, hoping the brightness would chase away the oppressive dread that clung to her. One night, as she sat curled up on her couch, she decided to snap a picture of the man. She grabbed her phone, zoomed in, and took the photo. When she looked at the image, her stomach dropped. The man's face was visible now, and it was grotesque. His skin was waxy and pale, stretched taut over sharp cheekbones. His eyes were wide and entirely black, like pools of ink, and his lips were twisted into a cruel smile. Her phone buzzed in her hand, making her scream. A message appeared on the screen. "Stop looking." Claire's blood ran cold. She hadn't given her number to anyone recently, and the message had no sender. She deleted the photo immediately, her hands trembling. The next time Claire saw him, he wasn't outside her window. He was inside her apartment. She awoke in the middle of the night to the oppressive feeling of being watched. Her bedroom was bathed in darkness, but she could sense him. Slowly, she turned her head. He was standing in the corner of the room, his gaunt frame illuminated faintly by the streetlight outside. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. His eyes were wide and unblinking, locked onto hers. She tried to convince herself it was a hallucination, but then he moved, a slow, deliberate step toward her bed. Claire bolted upright, her voice finally escaping in a hoarse scream. She fumbled for the lamp, flicking it on, but the corner was empty. Her apartment was silent, yet she knew he had been there. The sheets were cold where she had felt his presence. Days turned into weeks, and Claire's life unraveled. She refused to sleep, terrified of waking up to find him standing over her again. She quit her job, unable to focus or function. Her friends grew distant, frustrated with her constant paranoia. Her apartment became a prison. She installed extra locks, nailed her windows shut, and even taped over the peephole in her door. But no matter what she did, she couldn't escape the feeling of his eyes on her. One night, desperate for answers, she scoured the internet for anything that could explain what was happening. She found stories, accounts from others who had seen him. They all described the same man, the same unblinking eyes. None of the stories ended well. Claire knew she couldn't live like this anymore. She packed a bag, intending to leave the apartment for good. But as she approached her front door, she stopped. The locks were undone. She was certain she had bolted them earlier. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A new message. Don't leave. Her breath hitched as the doorknob turned slowly. The door creaked open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. And there he was, standing just outside, his black eyes gleaming with anticipation. Claire backed away, her heart pounding. She grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and hurled it at him. The lamp shattered against the wall and the man stepped inside, closing the door behind him. For the first time, he spoke. "You shouldn't have looked," he said, his voice a guttural whisper. "Now you're mine." The next morning, Claire's apartment was empty. Her belongings were untouched, but there was no sign of her. The only clue was a single blackened fingerprint on her bedroom window. Her disappearance became a local mystery, but those who lived nearby whispered of the man with black eyes. He was still seen standing under the streetlight at night, always watching, always waiting. And now, he's watching you. Story 7. The Laughter in the Attic. After Great-Aunt Billy's passing, her old house became a project for the family. It stood at the edge of a quiet town, shrouded by ancient trees that seemed to bow under the weight of time. The house itself was massive, with creaking floorboards and wallpaper peeling like old skin. Aunt Billy had lived there alone for decades, and though she often spoke of hearing the children laughing upstairs, no one ever believed her. When the family began clearing out the attic, they found a dusty, locked box shoved into a dark corner. Its surface was etched with strange, unrecognizable symbols. Inside were sepia-toned photographs that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. The most unsettling was a picture of two children, a girl with a distorted, screaming face and a boy with vacant, hollow eyes. They stood in what was unmistakably Aunt Billy's living room. Nobody in the family could recognize the children. Their clothes were old-fashioned, like something out of the early 1900s. And yet, the more they stared at the photograph, the more they felt as if the children were staring back that night. Strange things began to happen. Soft laughter echoed through the house, faint but unmistakable. It started at midnight, drifting down from the attic like the ghost of a song. At first, the family brushed it off as creaking wood or wind whistling through cracks. But as the night wore on, the laughter grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't joyous laughter. It was mocking, chilling, like the sound of children playing a cruel joke. Nathan, one of Aunt Billy's great-nephews, volunteered to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, he ascended the narrow attic stairs. The laughter stopped the moment he opened the door. The attic was silent, save for the occasional drip of water from a leaky roof. Nathan's flashlight flickered, its beam falling on the spot where the box had been. The photograph of the children was gone. The next morning, the family searched the attic thoroughly. In the farthest corner, beneath a pile of decaying furniture, they found a small wooden door built into the wall. It was barely large enough for a child to crawl through. None of them had ever noticed it before. Curiosity got the better of them, and they pried it open. Beyond the door was a narrow tunnel, the walls lined with old, yellowed wallpaper. At the end of the tunnel was a tiny room filled with broken toys, doll heads, and crumbling picture books. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something metallic, like blood. On the floor was the photograph of the children. But now it was different. The boy's hollow eyes seemed to follow them, and the girl's scream was frozen in a new position, her head tilted slightly toward the camera. That night, the laughter returned, louder and more insistent. The family gathered in the living room, too frightened to sleep. Suddenly the lights flickered, and the sound of tiny footsteps echoed through the house. They came from the attic, then the stairs, and finally stopped just outside the living room door. Nathan, summoning what little courage he had left, flung the door open. The hallway was empty, but the faint imprint of small, bare feet marked the dusty floor. They led back upstairs. Determined to put an end to the madness, Nathan and his brother James decided to seal the attic door. As they hammered nails into the wood, the laughter turned into screams. It was as if dozens of voices were crying out in unison, pleading and angry. The next morning, the family found the attic door wide open. The nails lay scattered on the floor, and the photograph was sitting at the top of the stairs. This time, the girl's face had shifted again. She was smiling. By now, the family was desperate to leave. They packed their belongings hastily, planning to abandon the house and never look back. But as they prepared to go, the laughter began again, louder than ever. It seemed to come from every corner of the house. Nathan went upstairs one last time, determined to grab his belongings. When he didn't return, James followed him. He found Nathan standing in the attic, staring at the photograph. The girl's face was no longer distorted. It was serene, almost lifelike. But the boy's eyes were now glowing, a faint, malevolent light emanating from the picture. "We can't leave," Nathan said, his voice hollow. "They won't let us." James grabbed his brother's arm, dragging him down the stairs. As they reached the front door, the laughter turned into screams. The house shook violently, the walls cracking and splintering. Shadows darted across the walls, small and childlike but wrong, their limbs bending in unnatural ways. The family fled into the night, leaving everything behind. As they drove away, they looked back to see the attic window glowing faintly. Two small silhouettes stood there, watching them leave. The house remained empty for years. Locals claimed to hear laughter echoing from the attic on quiet nights. Some said they saw the children standing at the windows, their faces pressed against the glass. One day, the house was demolished. As the wrecking ball hit the attic, workers reported hearing screams that faded into laughter. When the rubble was cleared, they found a single photograph lying on the ground. It showed two children standing in a field, their backs to the camera. But in the reflection of a puddle at their feet, their faces stared back, smiling. Months after the demolition, Nathan began receiving mail at his new apartment. The first envelope contained no return address and held only a single photograph, the same two children. This time, they were standing in front of a new building that looked eerily like his apartment complex. Their smiles had grown wider. That night, the laughter returned. It echoed through his empty apartment, growing louder with each passing hour. At midnight, Nathan heard soft knocking on his door, followed by the unmistakable sound of tiny footsteps moving inside his apartment. When the police arrived the next morning, they found the apartment empty. Nathan was gone, but the photograph lay on his bed. The children's faces had changed once more. Now they weren't smiling. They were staring, their blackened eyes filled with rage. From that day forward, tenants in the building reported hearing laughter in the hallways late at night. And every now and then, someone would find a photograph slipped under their door, showing two children who seemed to be watching, waiting.